Good evening, Assalamu alaikum, and in some places, of course, good morning. Welcome to the keynote session of ThinkFest Conversations online for the season of 2021. Today, we have our final talk of the season, which is our keynote, and it is our great honor and pleasure to host a superstar today for our keynote, and we're very grateful that he's taken time out this early morning to come and speak to us today and deliver our keynote. Our keynote is being delivered, as you know, by Professor Daniel Kahneman, who is the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology Emeritus and the Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs Emeritus at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs. Professor Kahneman has had positions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the University of British Columbia, the University of California, Berkeley, and a number of other places. He's a member of the National Academy of Science, the Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the American Psychological Association. And I've just realized if I read his full bio, it might take about 12 minutes. So I will cut that short and mention that he is the author of several best-selling books. And he also received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. So Professor Daniel Kahneman, Danny, it is a huge pleasure that you have taken your time out here to come and speak to us, and we're very excited to host you, at least virtually, on the ThinkFest.
I'm delighted to be with you.
In conversation with Professor Daniel Kahneman, we also have our Pakistani superstar, Professor Natasha Anwar. She is a pathologist working for the Aga Khan University Hospital at the moment, doing lots of very interesting medical research, at the cutting edge of medical research, I must say. She's worked formerly at the Formal Christian College, where we were colleagues. She's an amazing scientist, and we have grand hopes that she'll win all those amazing prizes for Pakistan and actually take Pakistani science to the next level. So here's putting pressure on Natasha, but thank you so much for doing this for us and for being in conversation here with Professor Daniel Kahneman.
Yaqub, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. I think the closest I'm going to get to a Nobel Prize is having a conversation with Danny today. I don't think I'm going to get any much closer than that, but thank you very much for just such a warm and very generous introduction.
I should also sort of note for our viewers that Natasha is actually our Nobel laureate interlocutor. Because she did the exact same thing, albeit in person, about a year and a bit ago with Sir Venki Ramakrishnan, who was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in 2007 when he came at the Lahore ThinkFest. So she's becoming very quickly a veteran at these talks. So again, welcome to both of you, and we're very excited about this keynote conversation, which of course is based on Professor Kahneman's books and his most recent work. And today, the topic, as we have kind of advertised, is decision-making, the good, the bad, and the bias. So with that, over to you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Yaqub. Danny, it's a privilege this evening. A very virtual welcome to Lahore. And I just, a big disclaimer here, as I mentioned in our conversation a few days ago, that I am not a psychologist or an economist, but I'm somebody who's very fascinated by your book, and somebody who has to make decisions for myself and for other people, and in terms of managing other people. And that's why I just, I have so many questions, but I'm going to start. I'm going to start very basic and sort of ask you about, some decisions or some things that, are put in front of us. They're very instant, and we know automatically, yes, that's what I want to do, or that's the right answer, or that's what I'd like to eat. Other things, you've got to sort of pause a little bit. So what's going on in our minds there? How is this working? What's actually happening?
Well, I think that there are really, as you point out, those two quite distinct modes for ideas to come to mind. So there is the completely automatic mode, which is, when I say 2 + 2, something comes to your mind. When I say, how is your mother, something comes to your mind. An emotion comes to your mind. These are this is automatic. It happens to you. This is really doesn't have the feel of something that you do. In contrast, if I ask you to compute 17 times 24, you'll have to do it unless you're a prodigy with memory for numbers. You'll have to generate it. It will be slower, and it will involve effort. And the effort has physiological manifestations, but it's quite distinctive. When you are in a state of mental effort, it primarily the main manifestation of that is that it's difficult for you to do other things. So
no, that's true, because I have to share something. I was having my friend called me at work yesterday, and I was staring at my computer screen, and all of a sudden an email popped up. And in the email, there was something very serious and very important, and I had to think about what I was going to respond. But she kept on talking to me, and I was mumbling something, and then all of a sudden she said, "What are you talking about?" So I think that that's exactly what happened. I think because I had to think about the response, everything else just switched off around me.
Precisely. I mean, this is what happens when, if you're driving a car and somebody asks you a question. If it's a difficult question and you're making a difficult turn, or overtaking a car, you are not going to be able to answer. When the tasks are demanding, we can literally do one thing at a time.
Okay, so in your book, it's really great, because you talk about this instant fast response and the slower response, and you you delineate them into two systems, and you've addressed through various experimentation the strengths and weaknesses of each system. I was wondering if you could maybe just elaborate a little bit more about these two systems and their strengths and weaknesses.
Well, I think that what people are most interested in when I talk about those topics is the notion of intuition. And intuition is fast thinking. And people really ask themselves, can I trust my intuition? Can I trust the intuitions of other people? And the answer is that sometimes you can, sometimes you cannot. Intuition is sometimes marvelous and quite often deeply flawed. And subjectively, it is very difficult to know when your intuition is on the mark and when it is biased or really not based on anything in particular. But there are ways of telling, and that, I think, is one of the more interesting things that I think I have observed in this domain, is that you can determine whether your intuitions or the intuitions of someone else are valid or not. You have an excited dog in the background.
Yes, I'm sorry. He's obviously seen somebody he doesn't like very much, and he's very excited. Yes.
So, should I go on?
Yes. Sorry. Is it? It's actually really disturbing. Let me just see if I can.
I'll give you a couple of minutes if there's something that you want to do.
We need to just get the dog to calm down a bit, please. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, no problem whatsoever. Yeah. So examples of marvelous intuition are easy to find. For example, a chess player, a master chess player, goes by a chessboard and can say mate in 3. That is, they can see things that other people cannot. Physicians, some physicians who are experts in a particular illness can diagnose that illness sometimes across the room and in an instant and without asking any questions, just by looking at a patient. Those are examples of marvelous intuitions. And other examples are that I'm sure that when you speak to your spouse over the telephone, one word is sufficient for you to know your spouse's mood. And that's because we have expertise, intuitive expertise in our spouse's mood. So this is fast thinking, and it's fast thinking at its best. But And typically, when you have those intuitions, you're very confident in them. They come with a sense that you know. In fact, intuition is experience as knowing something without knowing how you know it. Um, but in fact, there are many cases in which when we have what subjectively appears to be an intuition, and it's just not valid. So
And why isn't it valid? Is that because this bias has come into its generation, and that's why it's not?
well,
It's not.
actually, intuitive expertise depends on three conditions. And unless these conditions are met, you shouldn't trust anyone's intuitions. So the first one is that there should be a regularity in the real world that can be learned. So, for example, in the stock market, there are no regularities. And anybody who has intuitions in the stock market either has a legal internal information or is just having a delusion, because you need a regular world to have intuitions. The other one is you need a lot of opportunity to learn that world in which you have intuitions. And the third is that the feedback from the world has to be clear and immediate. That is, you have to know when you have a guess or when you have an idea, you have to know fairly quickly whether it's right or wrong. When those three conditions are satisfied, and that's true for chess players, and that's true for you speaking to your spouse on the phone, when those three conditions are satisfied, intuition is trustworthy. When the conditions are not satisfied, people still have intuitions, but they should not be trusted.
That's brilliant. I think this has really given me a fantastic insight and way into which to actually assess my own intuition. Now, this is great. So, when we talk about trust and how important and the fact that all of these three factors have to really be present in order for us to actually develop a reliable intuition rather than a stronger one, a reliable intuition. So why is it that when these factors are not there, there's still a very, very strong, very, very strong feeling, very strong intuition that's, no, I'm right. This is the right thing to do.
And the reason, when do we feel confident that we've got it right? We feel confident when only one thing comes to mind, and when you cannot easily imagine alternatives to whatever it is that you think is happening. So that is really the condition for strong intuition. But of course, this is completely independent of whether you know what is happening or you don't.
Right,
It's quite
right.
easy to feel a great deal of confidence simply because you cannot imagine anything else, but that doesn't mean you're right. It just
No.
means you can't imagine it.
And is there anything else in terms of how, whether at the back of your mind there is something else there about what you're likely to gain or lose from, and is that playing on the intuition as well? Is that adding to the
No,
intensity of that intuition?
I think we have intuitions about what we can gain or lose, but I do not immediately see a connection. What is important, and I'll give you an example of a situation where intuitions can develop without those conditions being satisfied. So, one of the professions we've studied is underwriters in insurance companies. Now, underwriters do not get feedback. That is, when they insure large risks, usually nothing happens. And if something happens, it happens 10 years later. So an underwriter actually lives in a world without feedback. And yet, some underwriters are recognized as experts, and many underwriters have increasing confidence as they over their career, completely unjustified. That is, it's not justified in the sense that they're not getting feedback from reality. And their internal confidence comes from basically agreeing with themselves. That is, when you have been doing the same kind of thing for a long time and you
Right.
have developed your habits of doing it consistently so
Mhm.
that you cannot imagine doing it any other way, that is when you have a lot of confidence, although what you are doing may be completely unconnected with reality.
Wow. Okay. So your work with the underwriters. So you found that it was just this repetitive nature of their work because they had done, I don't know how many cases they had actually each
Mhm.
underwriter had actually been involved in. But my guess is that the thousands and
Quite a
thousands of
few.
cases that they would, yeah. So that would actually really add. So the number of repetitions.
It's the number of repetitions. And
Yes.
for underwriters who insure large risks, it's not in the thousands.
Mm,
They take a while. But the main thing is that what gives you the sense that you're learning how to do it is that you're developing consistent habits about how to
mm,
do it. And as you develop consistent habits, you become incapable of imagining doing it any other way.
right.
And the inability to think about alternatives, this is what gives you confidence in your judgment, even when there is no
Even
reason
when
for you to feel
there's no
confident.
reason. And so is it luck that sometimes you would get it right?
Well, you don't, for underwriters, there is hardly any sense in which you can say they're getting it right or wrong. You can say
Mm,
whether they're doing it the same way that other underwriters would, but there is a lot of variability in how
mm.
different underwriters look at the same problem. And yet every one of them is quite confident that they're doing it right. And they're not the only profession in which that occurs. That occurs in many other professions.
I mean, medicine in terms of profession. Um, I mean, again, you have lots of different disciplines in medicine, um, but a key sort of unifying factor is diagnoses and trying to find out exactly what's wrong with your patient. And as you said, right at the beginning, that there are some physicians that know intuitively when patients walk into their room what's wrong with them. Now, is that because, again, their experience and having seen the same thing, and sort of then, are they doing system two? Are they actually
Well,
thinking back and
a physician who has a lot of experience with one particular disease will quite possibly develop intuitive expertise in recognizing that disease at a glance. However, there is a, significant danger here because a physician can be an intuitive expert in diagnosing one disease, but not in general, not in diagnosing other disease. That is, the
mm,
feedback and the experience have to be specific. And
mm.
yet, anyone who is a real expert in one domain feels like an expert in other domains and may be overconfident in other domains. So, intuitive expertise is a fascinating business and quite a
So
difficult topic.
yes, I think to even sort of ask about intuition is also very challenging. But I was just going to, you know, so a good decision, a good decision should be a balance between intuition and and reason.
Well, uh, a good decision should be reasonable. That is, it should be defensible, or else it should stem from experience and from long experience making similar decisions. You feel a lot better in your decisions if you're intuitively satisfied with them. But what we say in thinking about how to make good decisions is that actually delaying intuition is a very good idea. That is, our intuitions tend to jump to conclusions. And, and once we have had an intuition about a particular problem, then most of what we do is to try to justify that intuition, collect more evidence that favors it, interpret evidence as it comes in a way that favors it. And that is not very useful. So delaying that sense of confidence until you have more of the information until you have all the information. That is very useful. But having a sense of confidence at the end is also useful.
I mean, I think this is something that researchers and as I'm speaking as a scientist, having spent a few years in research, this is exactly what we do. We pick up on this. If we see a problem, we have a question, and we've already got the answer before we've actually gone through the whole process of actually, so the way that we design our experiments, you've got to have a hypothesis right at the beginning. And what you do through your experimentation is to prove that hypothesis. So this is exactly the situation you're describing. So there's a lot of element of bias then in which we do see in research.
Well, the bias actually has a name, and it's confirmation bias. That is, that when we have a hypothesis, we tend to be very sensitive to evidence that supports it, and relatively insensitive to evidence that refutes it. It is said of Charles Darwin that he did not need to take notes when the observations he made confirmed his prior thoughts, but he was very careful to take notes whenever he would encounter something that he found difficult to explain or contrary to his expectations.
Yeah, and I mean, so along with this, something that I often come up with during my own, sort of development of, Umar, sorry, 1 second.
I cannot hear you now.
Sorry, I was muted.
You were muted, yes.
Yes, I was muted. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. So we're looking at, sorry, I was just asking you about the idea of bias, and then something that often comes to my own work is sort of trying to understand and expand on systematic errors. And again, I think that's something that you did quite a little bit of work on in terms of understanding, again, explaining decision making and all its components. That was again something that a theme that comes up quite a lot in the book as well.
Indeed. Yeah, this is really Thinking Fast and Slow. The main topic of Thinking Fast and Slow really was errors of judgment. That's where a lot of the research came from, the study of errors. And errors are quite predictable. I mean, it's not, there are different categories of errors, there are different categories of traps that we tend to fall into. And they're recognizable, but quite difficult to avoid, because when you're busy making a mistake, you do not have the spare capacity to be thinking about whether you're making a mistake. So detecting one's own mistakes in real time is quite hard.
Is that because you need to sort of, again, pause and reflect and actually know that you're actually making a mistake?
That's right. Yeah. And it's what makes it very difficult is that the mistakes, and that's a theme of our conversation today, the mistakes are made with considerable confidence. That is, you cannot tell by your level of confidence whether you're doing things right or wrong, because many mistakes come with high confidence. And so they come without alternative, they come without doubt. So you have to examine the situation from the outside. So for example, you have to ask, do I have the basis to know this? Are the conditions for expertise or for intuition satisfied? And perhaps I don't. Or is this a situation where I make a particular kind of error that I have learned about? And can I recognize this as a situation where I'm prone to make an error? An example is visual illusions. So everybody is familiar with visual illusions. You see something and you're told that you see it wrong, and you know that you see it wrong because you can take a ruler to it and verify, and yet you keep seeing it wrong. So that the only recourse, the only solution to this is that when you see that pattern that you know causes your visual system to make an error, to generate an illusion, you recognize, oh, this is where I cannot trust my vision. This is where I should be using a ruler. So that's the way, and it's extremely difficult to do, but that's the way to control errors and biases.
And do you think that these errors and biases actually also kind of contribute to conflicts within organizations, within teams? It kind of leads to because you've got that bias, you've got that element of systematic errors, so you've got
You're muted again. I can't hear you, Natasha.
Oh, hello? Can you
I
hear
couldn't
me?
hear you for a while.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry. Yeah. So did you hear the last part of the question?
No.
No, I can just I can just go through it again. So this is where all the distractions actually kind of shift our thoughts from system one to system two. I was just asking about conflicts and conflicts between between individuals, and is that could we sort of relate that to how we've built up our own understanding and our own biases and the systematic errors in our own judgment making? How much of that contributes to conflicts and misunderstanding of the people?
I'm not sure I completely understand your question, but the one thing that is very clear is that in interactions with other people, the element of trust is absolutely essential. And indeed, most of our beliefs are based on trust in particular individuals or in organizations. And if somebody I like says something, I'm inclined to believe them and to believe that what they're saying is true. And if somebody I don't like says something, I'm inclined to look for flaws and to believe that it is not true. So we're strongly biased in our acceptance of information and processing of information. We're strongly biased by the source from which this information comes. And if there is conflict, we're going to be biased, certainly.
Yeah, sorry, that's exactly where I was trying to sort of steer us to the next sort of series of questions. Is this idea about trust and the fact that our decisions, if they are guided by intuition, most of the time, that's what we're constantly doing most of the time, and this is being then reinforced again and again by sort of the elements of trust. So if we do like so it's an emotion associated with decision making, and that's exactly what carries on. So you've got as you just said, when you are friends with somebody, you're more likely to actually tolerate a lot more, as opposed to if you're not very friendly with them. And I think that was again something that I maybe wanted to sort of tease out a little bit, that how do we stop ourselves from actually, because that, I think, to me, that sort of when I sort of went back and thought about my own decision making, and some of the errors that I've made in certain decisions that I've made, it does come back to the whole thing that, had I perhaps not really thought negatively about that other person's opinion or something, I would have made a slightly different decision. So how can we stop? Can we stop ourselves doing this? Is this something that we can actually sort of, unlearn?
Not in general. That is, I think on occasion, this is one situation where what I was saying earlier comes into play. That is, somebody can say something and you don't believe it. And then you can catch yourself and saying, well, really, I don't believe it because I don't like that person. But let's try to divorce what the person is saying from my attitude or my emotions about that person. This is an effort. And it's very well worth doing if the topic is important, because we tend to be very strongly biased by our emotional attitude to the source. And indeed, all our beliefs come from trust in sources. For example, my belief, and this is true even in the context of science. So I believe in climate change, and I have absolutely no evidence. There's no support for my belief, except that I believe in the National Academy of Sciences, and they tell me, there is climate change. So in that sense, there is less of a difference between science and our believing in science and our believing in other things that are not science, our having faith in leaders or having faith in religion. It's all very similar in the sense that trust is primary, and we get most of our opinions and most of our beliefs by trusting others. Again, you're muted.
I apologize for that. I'm so sorry. So making decisions for others, does that, again, is that something that one should actually spend a little bit more time being careful about and not being an instinctive, intuitive decision making? We see that a lot again in medicine. So we've got paternalism. So it's paternalism is when doctors are making decisions for patients where they feel that they think that that's what's the best for the patient. And when you're making these kind of when you're making decisions for members of your team or on a sort of national level in government, when you're making decisions for countries, collective decision making. How does that, how do we navigate as individuals, and how do we sort of come together as in collective decision making?
Well, there are many things that come into play when teams make decisions or when groups make decisions. One of the interesting things that come into play is a phenomenon called polarization, that when you have a group who basically, from the beginning, they tend to agree with one another, they tend to end up with a position that is more extreme in the same direction than the position they started out with. That is, each person gets reinforced by the opinions of other people, and the groups moves in a more extreme direction. So that's one of the phenomena that make group decision making sometimes not very good. And this phenomenon of polarization. We are enormously influenced by the beliefs of others, and the conformity to the beliefs of others has a very big influence and reduces the value of deliberation. So if, for example, the first person says something, and I'm sure you will recognize it, I know it's quite powerful with me, that we come out of a film and I like the film very much, but you say, oh, this was terrible. My next comment is not going to be, oh, I like it very much. My next comment is going to move in your direction. And I say, well, maybe it has weaknesses, but I still liked it. So I'm going, in my comment, I'm going towards you immediately. So that is a process that actually reduces the value of group deliberation. It's the very great influence that people have on each other.
And what sort of I'm asking you to really very broad question here, but so the kind of people who actually do have this strength of pulling others' opinions and pulling others towards their own judgments, and so what sort of characteristics do these sort of individuals have, and do they make good managers?
this is not really my area of expertise, but certainly leaders have that characteristic that other people. And one of the elements, I mean, of course, saying that they have to have charisma is just circular. It doesn't add much information. Of course, they have to have charisma. Uh, they have to be influential. People have to have some confidence in themselves. And sometimes we put too much trust in people who are confident in themselves.
Yes.
So they've got to be confident. Often they've got to be optimistic. They've got to make us feel good about whatever it is that we're trying to do as a group, feel that it's achievable. So optimism is a characteristic of successful leaders, and sometimes exaggerated optimism. And then there are qualities which are quite superficial qualities, but they're qualities of looks and voice and tone and melody that have a large influence on whether people want to agree with you or don't want to agree with you. And some people who are handsome and have good voices and high confidence can get people to believe in them with very little basis, although they can be actually empty vessels.
And do we become a little bit lazy in actually then and allowing these people to sort of take the effort of making the more difficult decisions?
Well, our tendency to trust people and to look for leaders, especially in periods of stress, is well documented. And so, people naturally look for somebody when they're in doubt about what to do, they look for someone around them who seems to know what to do, and then they will want to follow these people. Yes, that is certainly the case.
Okay. So one other thing that I was really sort of interested in asking you about was the role of artificial intelligence now, and how that's amazing, because those are, algorithms and computers are now extremely efficient and instant at actually making decisions and judgment calls. And even in medicine, even in pathology, we've got lots of new roles and new avenues of artificial intelligence algorithms. In medicine, we've got, again, this role is expanding. So I was just, thinking that is there anything that can potentially go wrong with this? Because you're missing that system too. Computers are great because they've been programmed by us, and they're great because they've got that system one working perfectly. But the system one, the way we want the system one to work. So how?
Well, computers have several advantages over people, and the first one is that they're noise free, in the sense that if you put the same problem to a computer twice, to an algorithm twice, you're going to get the same answer. This is not true when you're asking different doctors, or even the same doctor on different occasions. You're going to get different diagnoses, whether a diagnostic program is going to be reliable. That turns out to be a big advantage, because noise is a major source of error. Modern programs of artificial intelligence have a major advantage over humans, in that they are based on a vast database, and they have more data than any human could accumulate in several lifetimes.
Yes,
And
lots of repetitions.
they
Yes.
have immediate access to all that data. So ultimately, when you have a lot of information that you can feed into a computer because it is codable, when much of the information that is available to a human judge is made available to the computer, and there is a database, and there is outcomes from which you can learn, then the computer is going to be better than the human at making the judgment. This is happening in quite a few domains, including the I think, some types of breast cancer,
Yes.
the recognition of retinal diseases, playing Go, playing chess. There are quite a few domains in which AI is already clearly superior to humans, and there are going to be more and more of those as time goes by.
And you don't think that we're going to, with that, there are certain contexts in which these are going to obviously be very, very useful and important, but any context in where we would probably be a little wary of using AI?
Well, I think we should be wary of using AI everywhere because we're losing control but on the other hand, in terms of the number of mistakes that AI do, they make fewer mistakes than we do in many domains. And the development of artificial intelligence is so rapid that in domains where artificial intelligence is approaching human performance, you can be certain that within a year or two, it will exceed human performance. Self-driving cars, we're all extremely sensitive to their flaws and to their accidents, but they're already vastly safer than humans. It's just that we don't like them. We don't like the idea of autonomous thinking and autonomous decision making, and they need to be much, much safer than humans for us to accept them. It's a little similar to vaccines. It's not enough for a vaccine to save as many lives as people as it costs in terms of people dying from the vaccine. The vaccine has to save hundreds of times more than it costs. And something like that is happening. We are strongly biased against artificial intelligence.
And one of the other things that I've kind of found really remarkable is just how much of a role digital media and social media now have on our way of making decisions, and swerving our decision making one way or the other. And something that I was thinking about while reading the first couple of chapters of your book was that System 2 is there just to keep System 1 in check, and it keeps on sort of, just doing a bit of a surveillance and checking that if System 1 is working okay, providing it with a little bit more information, additional information, so that it can just, again, make sure that it's functioning properly and doing what it's supposed to do, which is, which is to make instant decisions. But it seems to me as though now social media and these digital media platforms are kind of now behaving as surrogate System 2s. And they're sort of, they're the ones that are actually sort of now providing and feeding our intuition, and feeding and then sort of feeding or sort of navigating our intuition.
I think this goes back to what we were talking earlier in terms of trust and the sense that there is a community of people, and it's a community of people like you with whom in general you tend to agree. If they believe in something, then you are already prone to believe the same thing. And it's that sense of a community, of being a member of people who are basically like me with the same beliefs and the same values, that greatly strengthens the impact of any rumor, any idea that comes and seems to have the support of many people in that community. I will be inclined to join in that belief.
And I think the other thing is that does our intuition change with context? So I know I'm here in Lahore right now. I could be somewhere else tomorrow, or something else could change. Considering that we've just come through 18 months of a global pandemic, again, the pandemic has changed the context completely. So do you think that the pandemic has changed the way people think? For most of us, that's what's happened? That it's put us in a totally different...
I don't think that the pandemic has changed human psychology. So I don't believe that, in general, there has been a profound change in the way that people think. The contents of what we think have certainly changed, and we have all been through a lot of experiences, like being lonelier than we had been
Mm,
before, being
mm,
cooped up at home. For many parents, being with their children 24 hours a day, which normally they would not be.
then I'll
And
be,
for
yes.
many children, there have been really difficult experiences of not being able to go to school. So we've all lived through different things, but I don't think that, our thinking has been altered in any deep ways.
Mm. Because we've seen a lot of behavioral differences across different countries in terms of their responses uh, to various SOPs that governments have implemented, whether it's social distancing or wearing PPEs, wearing masks, and then with vaccination. So decisions to maintain physical distance and to wear the masks, it's been really varied in different countries, and the choice to do that and the decision to sort of decide, yes, this is something that I think is important, or this is something that I don't think is going to it doesn't affect me. I just thought that maybe because we hadn't experienced anything like this, at least many of us hadn't lived through something like this before, that because this context had changed, we didn't have all the facts there to make the right kind of choices and decisions.
I think, we made decisions during the pandemic very much as we make them in general.
Mm,
And that is by looking at what other people do. It was very
yes.
clear, for example, in New York, that after a while, people were watching each other. And when more and more people were wearing masks, then it became the norm to wear
Mm,
masks. And there were many months in New York where you would rarely would see people without masks. Now, in other areas of the country where mask wearing behavior did not catch on,
mm,
then this did not develop. And indeed, it became a sign of membership in some communities that they do not wear masks and do not vaccinate. And,
yeah.
so this, it actually, I think, is a historic accident, what's happened in the United States, that the Democratic Party believes in vaccines and the Republican Party doesn't. This
Mm,
really happened completely accidentally, but I don't believe there is anything deep, that forces Republicans not to believe in vaccines. But once they have started that way, it becomes a sign of membership in a community
mm,
that you do not vaccinate and you do not wear masks. And indeed, you're opposed to it because doing those things indicates that you're a member of another community, the other community that you don't like. So
mm,
once those attitudes develop, people obey them. What this shows you again is how little our decisions are governed by logic. I mean, it
yes.
is people are not making health decisions by
No,
weighing
not
the pros and cons of
no,
health decisions. They're
no.
following, they're trusting.
Yes, absolutely. And this is what was most remarkable to me, that although that this time, during the pandemic, it's incredible. I've never seen this kind of scientific information and evidence base being shared so rapidly and so openly. And despite that, it was still amazing to see how many people just didn't trust that science and the information. And they
Well,
went with, yeah, it was remarkable.
I mean, it's clear that, there is no reason really why the public should trust scientists. When the scientists are in conflict with other
Yeah.
opinion leaders or religious
Yes. Yeah.
leaders, then
Yeah.
people who have believed in religion all their life rather than in science are
Mm,
going to prefer the message they get from the sources they trust.
mhm,
And people who believe in science are exactly the same. They follow the advice of the sources they trust. So this is really what is happening, and and it shows that people are much less rational in their decision making. They're much less, they do much less by reason than
mm,
actually they think they do, because they think they're doing the right thing because it's the right thing. But they're doing the right thing, or they're doing something because they're following others who are doing the same thing without knowing that this is what it's doing.
So, if I were to sort of ask again about good decision making, so it seems to me that what's coming up very strongly is that a good decision really has a number of different components, and most of us are actually making decisions following other people's behavior and whether or not we trust them, that's the easier thing to do. Is that why we make those decisions, or
Absolutely.
we follow that person because it's just easier? We don't want to tax our minds too much. We don't want to take that effort to try and really sort of look at the rational.
We don't even think that it's necessary. I mean,
we don't even think it's necessary.
It's not a, and also, in fact, trusting others is ultimately necessary, and that is true for people who believe in masks and in vaccination just as much as it is true for people who don't believe in these things. We just choose whom to trust. And we don't even choose that. Depending on the community that we belong to, that determines whom we trust.
Mm-hmm. And so, if I were to sort of ask you about what can I do to avoid making bad decisions, if I were to sort of ask you if you could just share the sort of a few things about how to sort of avoid making those bad decisions, or know that you're making a bad decision.
I think that recognizing, and in the first place, it's hard to do, and few people will do it, but the people who are introspective and are curious about themselves, they can recognize situations in which they're prone to make errors. That's what I was saying earlier. It's like recognizing a pattern, a visual pattern that causes an illusion. They can recognize that they have a high confidence in a belief, but actually it's based on nothing, on little or nothing. It's based on trust in sources that may not be trustworthy, or it's based on an intuition that comes from nowhere, that comes from not from reality. So you can ask yourself those questions, and we've looked at several during this hour. Are the three conditions for expert intuition satisfied? Am I susceptible to confirmation bias? Do I have any real reason to believe to trust in the person that I trust? So all these are questions that people can ask themselves, and to the extent they are successful, they can doubt themselves. They can doubt their own intuitions. This is hard to do, and it's often not a very happy situation to be in, to discover, because it's hard for people to develop alternatives.
Yes, because we're very comfortable with our confidence, aren't we? We're very comfortable with what's familiar to us. So I think that's absolutely true. Danny, thank you so much. This has been really fantastic. I apologize for the little bit of commotion that occurred earlier on. I had no idea that my husband was in the room. I apologize for that. But thank you so much for joining us today. If there's one last comment or something that you'd like to share with the audience here in Lahore, in Pakistan, that would be lovely. But if not, I will just like to thank you so much for sparing time. And I hope that we at some point we can try and get you to the ThinkFest live, inshallah next year, whenever Yaqub actually organizes another one of the conferences. So it would be wonderful to have you visit Lahore and to be able to actually talk to you in person.
It would be my pleasure, and I enjoyed our conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Danny. Goodbye. Take care.
Bye-bye.